Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, Astrophotography, Capturing the Stars, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader, Richard de Gouveia. It's a pleasure as always, Richard. I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thanks, Kendall, and welcome, guys. Today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite pastimes. Now, I've been known to take an image from time to time. I've been photographing for around 13 years and about half of that professionally. And I always love taking people out on trips and taking them out after dark. And this image here was taken in Madagascar, where we were lying between the rocks of Isalu, and I was going to do a star talk. And while we're doing it, I take some photos and then help the guests take photos of the stars. So I thought, while we're stuck at home for a little bit longer and hopefully out on trips soon, I could give you a couple of tips and pointers as to how to take photos of the stars. And hopefully you can also get some incredible joy out of it. So we often spend this time out. As it gets dark, we run inside, we put our cameras away, and we forget that there's this incredible universe around us. And it is this really beautiful bonding moment where if you take the time to just go outside and stare up, we always contemplate just how small we are in this universe and how much is out there. And it gives us a little bit of sense, as much of what this pandemic has done to us, that we're definitely not the biggest fish around. So when we're taking photos of stars, we have to contemplate what our universe looks like. Now, our universe is called the Milky Way. The Milky Way galaxy is made up of 400 billion stars. It is a magnanimous number of stars. And from end to end, it's actually shaped like a UFO. So it's a bit fatter in the middle and then tapers out to the edges. And the edge to edge is about 100,000 light years wide. And in height, it's about 5,000 light years high. Now, a light year is the speed that light, or the distance light travels in a year. Now, that is traveling at 286,000 miles per second. So that is quite a large distance, just our galaxy. And the reason why I point out this shape of it is because it is what makes our Milky Way. When we look into the fattest part, we see that band of stars, which a lot of us don't get to see anymore because of light pollution. The other thing we have to consider is how this all looks. So in winter, this is actually for the southern hemisphere. So in winter, you would be looking in the northern hemisphere out of the Milky Way. And in summer, you're going to be looking into the Milky Way. So your summertime would be the best time to photograph the Milky Way, whereas for us, our wintertime would be the best time to look and photograph the stars, because we're photographing into more of the Milky Way. So it's denser, it's thicker, and it shows up brighter. Now, we also have to remember that it is not a two-dimensional field that we're looking at. It's a three-dimensional field within which we are spinning. So if you consider that we're spinning, the stars aren't moving fast enough to make a difference, but we're spinning fast enough to make a difference. So those stars, or as we move, the stars would appear to move. And because of this movement, we have a point called the celestial south pole and the celestial north pole, and these are annotated by two things. In the north, you look for the North Star. Once you have found the North Star, that is due north. If you photograph that over time and created star trails, the North Star would never move. It would be static in that position the whole time. And for us in the southern hemisphere, we use the Southern Cross. And the Southern Cross is our way of figuring out where celestial south is. And this will make a big difference to specifically star trails or any movement that we might be able to, or trying to catch, like a time lapse. So to give you a visual of how much the stars move, this is a shot that was taken on one of our hidden South Africa, Botswana trips. over one of the lodges we used to visit called the Outpost. One of the most incredible views you can see. And you could just see how much those stars are moving. This was taken over about a 2-hour period. And that Milky Way is moving, or we're spinning, and the Milky Way is obviously staying where it would be. So we have to consider that, but the other part of doing astrophotography is planning around weather. Now, the weatherman is probably the most unreliable person to listen to on the planet. I'm terribly sorry if there's a weatherman or woman listening to this program, but the chances of getting it right are very, very slim. They're pretty much the only job that can get their job wrong 90% of the time and still get paid. But planning is essential around it, and we need to use as much data as what we can to be able to predict as best as possible what is going to be to happen. So it's essential, but not always perfect. And checking the weather doesn't always tell us what we need to know about astrophotography, because astrophotography requires of us to have no clouds, to have no moon. So we have to look at different sources to be able to do that. So I like these 2 apps that I use on my phone, Exasteria and Clear Outside. And Clear Outside works best for me. I've really liked the way it's put out, and I'll show you how things go. This was taken on another day, but effectively it gives me my hours of the day at the top, when will be my darkest time, so you can see where it's black up at the top there, what the moon phase is and when it rises and when it sets. So this is a very important part of what we're doing, because if the moon's out, a lot of the stars get lost. Total clouds, how much of the sky will be covered in clouds, and a whole bunch of other probabilities, precipitation, wind speed, chance of a front, dew point temperatures, all of these, fog, visibility, all of that plays a role in what we're seeing and how we're planning for this. So like I'm going on a trip this weekend, I've looked at the weather to make sure that it is going to be, whether it's going to be good for stars or bad for stars. If it's not going to be good for stars, I'm leaving my stuff behind, because then I really am not going to get the most out of it. And the other part that goes beyond the weather is light pollution. Now, as you can see, where most of you are living in the US, there is a huge amount of light pollution. You have to get out of that light pollution. This little dot down the bottom here is where I live, so there's quite a bit around me, but if I travel a couple of kilometers away or miles away from where I am, it gets beautifully dark. And this over here is Madagascar, and there's one little dot where Antananarivo is. So it is an incredible place to shoot the stars. So light pollution, in order to avoid it, we need to get out of the city or use it to your advantage in different ways. One of those being white balance. So this image here was shot on a cloudy white balance, and there is a city just outside one of the reserves where I worked, and it was cloudy, and the light from the city was bouncing off of the clouds. So what I did was I went into my white balance. Now you can choose different forms of white balance, and you can then go deeper into it, and it shows you a graph that will give you spectrums from green to blue to purple to cyan. So it's this really wide gamut of colors, and you can move them across. And I moved this right into the red point to try and boost it so that it looked like a sunset with the Milky Way in the background. So that's one of the ways we can utilize light pollution to try and make something different. Remember, it is an art. There are no, Ansel Adams always said, there are no rules for taking good photographs, only good photographs. So play around, be creative, try and get something different. The other way, this again was Madagascar, is by utilizing light sources. So this was the beaches light up like this because of the lodge's lights. And the lodge's lights were going down, and because there was a long exposure of 30 seconds, that light was amplified, and I had to balance it out with the sky and the ground to create a moody, beautiful image. And then there was the moon. And this was in Mashatu, again, one of the places we go on our hidden Botswana, South Africa trip. And you can see how the tree has now been lit up. So it's not just a silhouette. I used a very small waxing moon, so very small crescent moon, to light that up and create a little bit more light than what I would normally get out of it. And then, like I said, if the moon is fully bright or full moon, it's very difficult to capture a Milky Way, but we could extend the shutter speed to, this was 20 minutes, which created these trails, but because the moon was out, everything looked like daylight. So light pollution can be utilized. So your camera at night, basically, or not basically, photography is painting with light. You'll hear me say this very often in all of my tutorials, painting with light. It is the most important thing to remember, because once you understand that concept, you have better ability to change settings on your camera and manipulate it. And what we're doing with these cameras is we are capturing pinpoint stars. The sensors are literally reading photons. And when we were talking about light years, each one of those photons that is coming through the lens and hitting the sensor is going in there, has been traveling for hundreds to thousands of years. Remember, our galaxy is 100,000 light years wide. So the furthest star might be about 80,000 light years away from us. And that photon is hitting your sensor. So in actual fact, you're recording history when you are taking photos of the stars. But our modern sensors are amazing. And when we're doing this, we also have to consider what type of lens we're using. Telephoto lenses are fantastic for wildlife, and I use them a lot. With star photography, they're not so fantastic. Because if you consider anything that is zoomed in, if we have any shake, it's amplified. So because the Earth is moving, any movement will be amplified. Therefore, we cannot get the shutter speeds long enough with long lenses. So we want wide lenses. We want things that are going to show big skies, to be able to capture the Milky Way in all its glory and show the space that we're in. So wide lenses work really well. When we're thinking about that, remember, you might have a crop sensor, which means that a 24mm lens might effectively only be a 36mm lens. But the biggest thing we have to worry about is aperture, how big the hole is through which light comes in. And this hole through which light comes in is vitally important, because the bigger it is, the shorter our shutter speed can be, the time of recording, which means less chance of us capturing the movement of the Earth in the stars. So this is a great way of thinking about that. So there are two ways of getting focus. We can either use a live view and magnify it. So live view basically means not looking through the eyepiece. We actually switch on the back screen so we can see what's going on. We change our settings, and generally with live view, it is giving us the most accurate representation of what we're seeing. So it'll show me some stars, and then you can set a magnification either on a DSLR by pushing the plus button, your normal zoom, what you would zoom into your photos to see something a little closer, push that and it'll magnify in. Or some of the cameras would have a manual focus assist, which once you are in manual focus, if you twist the focus ring at all, it will automatically zoom in so you can see it. So effectively what we're trying to do, if you have a look at these stars here, when it's out of focus, they're quite big and fuzzy. And when they get in focus, they're much smaller. So I'm going to show you an example of what I did. So on my camera, on the Sony's, we've got a manual focus assist. And I went in and then I tweaked the top end or the focus ring, and it will zoom in. Now you'll see me start to focus. Look how big and fuzzy the star gets over here. And then as I get smaller and smaller, what I will do is I'll actually rocket. I will go past focus and then back again and make that sweeping motion smaller and smaller till I get to the most accurate point. And the reason why I do that is because if I go and I haven't got all the way there, it might look like it's in the right place, but it actually is not. The other way I could do it is by lighting up a tree like this, say with a flashlight, and then using my normal autofocus to focus on that. Especially if I have a subject in the foreground, the actual focus of the stars make less of a difference than ensuring I have focus on that tree. Or you could do it with a manual focus assist. Again, there you can see how that works. Now, because of the Earth spinning, our shutter speeds have to remain between 20 and 30 seconds, depending on how wide our lens is. Anything around 16 mils, 18 mils is fine. We can go at 30 seconds. 24 mils and closer, we're going to have to go shorter and shorter till we get there. And if we do that, the stars become like little tadpoles or sausages, because you get the star recording and then the Earth moves and we get this little tail like a comet behind it. The other thing we have to consider is noise. Now, noise is the most overrated thing on this planet in photography, but it does make a difference to our astrophotography because we are dealing with very low light. So we generally want to stick between 1600 and 3200. In my experience, going above 3200 has such a negligible effect that it's not worth going up there. Unless your lens is not fast enough. So let's say your lens is a 3.5 or an f4, then we can go up to to 6400 ISO. If we have a fast prime lens like a 1.8 or a 1.4, we could be shooting between 800 and 1600. Now, the one thing that ISO makes a difference in is dynamic range. And dynamic range is our ability to see the highest highlights and the darkest darks. And the ability for the camera to store data in all of those. So when I am doing post-production, I can push that up and down as I need to recover any shadows that might be there or to boost any highlights that might also be there because there's enough data there. The higher we go with that ISO, the smaller the dynamic range becomes. So think of a sunset. When we're in a sunset and we look at it and we go, oh my God, this is beautiful. Look at the colors, look at the beautiful landscape that's in front of us. We pull out our camera, we take the photo, and we've got this beautiful color sky and everything in the foreground is black. Or we have a beautifully colored foreground and a white sky because it's overexposed. This is because the dynamic range isn't high enough to be able to pull those together. So we have to find a balance between our ISO, because of the dynamic range, and our shutter speed, because of the fact that we can't shoot for too long, or we will obviously create those tadpoles. Now, when noise comes in, this is one of the best explanations of noise I have seen. And effectively what it says is when we are shooting in a rainstorm and we're filling buckets in a rainstorm, and it's a big rainstorm, if I put 10 buckets out, or how many are here, 8 buckets out, basically those buckets are going to fill up with water. The difference between each bucket may be a few drops, but if we average it out, it's not going to make a huge difference to things. However, when we're shooting at night and we are shooting with individual photons, unlike during the day when the sun is beaming and we have light galore coming in, our buckets are collecting different amounts. The highest bucket, say 14 photons. This may be one of our sensor points on the sensor. And the lowest one, about 6. So we've got to average these out. So they average out to, say, 9. So we have to add 3 pixels or amplify that one by 3 photons in order to get it. And that's when noise gets created, is when the sensor is trying to average things out so everything is alike. There are also different types of noise. So that first one was what we call shock noise. The other one we get is called thermal noise. This is created by heat. Our African climate, if we're shooting in summer, the evenings can quite easily be in the 80s, 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So our sensors get very hot, and that creates thermal noise, which are colored dots, often red, blue, and green on these sensors. We get hot pixels, which when a sensor is created, there is a a acceptable error rate on it. So there may be 1 or 2 points on the sensor that aren't working correctly. If it's within the range that the company defines, they will be happy with that. And if you're shooting long shutters, those hot pixels will start to show up very well. So what will often happen is we use long exposure noise reduction. So if I take a 30-second photo, the camera will then switch off and take another photo with the shutter closed, and you'll often see it say NR on the camera, or just be black out and you can't see the photo. You're thinking, oh no, the camera's broken, and 30 seconds later it will open up again. What it's done is taken a reference photo at the same temperature and same length to find the hot pixels and then use software to remove it. And then we have a function which is called high ISO noise reduction or noise smoothing. It basically looks like the picture's been painted over. I switch that off specifically because I don't want the camera deciding how much noise reduction is being done on my image. I would rather look at it in my post-production and work on it there to be able to get it right. So use it as you wish. The other thing we can do is paint with light. So we use a flashlight or anything that emits any light. We take a few test shots and then try the light from different angles, and with multiple lights. You can use 2 flashlights from different angles and it creates something like this. So we had one from the right-hand side, one from the left-hand side, and it helped create a lot of depth through the image rather than a 2-dimensional thing if I was sitting straight behind the camera and painting. So that's painting with light. So what do we need? Very, very important is a tripod. If you don't have a tripod, you need to have something very sturdy to work off of, but I recommend a tripod, and I recommend you not going cheap on a tripod. Rather spend a good $200 or $300 on getting a really good, really nice tripod, even more expensive if you can, but $200 or $300 will get you something decent. And what that will allow you to do is have something that will last you a lifetime. I've bought cheap equipment before, and I remember doing one long exposure in the deserts in the Namib. It was my first trip to Namibia. I was trying to get a long exposure. We'd woken up at 2 a.m. because the moon was up and we waited for it to go down, and we set this exposure. And what ended up happening was the camera slowly just started falling like this. And eventually I had the floor. So it was an incredible failure. Which I wasn't happy about, but the next time I went, when I got back, I bought myself a decent tripod. A cable release, which is a release that allows you to set off your shutter without touching your camera, so you avoid moving the camera. Even on a tripod, it can cause some movement and some blurring of the image. A good ball head, which is the part that goes on the tripod, so you've got to search those out. And a nice flashlight, always good to have when you're walking around in the dark, and making sure you don't get eaten by anything. So taking the shot, what I recommend is setting the camera to the widest zoom possible. This will allow you to be able to capture as much of the air and the space and the stars as possible. Now you've got to get focus. Now remember what I said about focus. You have to, there's 2 ways of doing it. Make sure. Check, double check, and check, because the last thing you want to do is spend a night out trying to photograph things and you get back and all of the images are soft. Make sure that focus is good. Then what we're going to do is compose and level the tripod to and ensure that it is sturdy so that we have no movement going on. Make sure your settings are correct, and we're going to go into settings shortly and then take the image. I just need to make sure I have, no, okay, so settings, I don't know why that slide's not here, sorry guys. So the settings, we've already spoken about 20 to 30 seconds, ISO between 1600 and 3200. What I would suggest is 30 seconds, 3200 with an aperture of 2.8, wide open, and you will get your image. And what you've got to consider when we're doing this, it is a landscape photo. Even though it is now a nightscape, we still need one very important part, a subject, something to tell a story. So in the left-hand photo here, I've chosen fireflies. And these guys were cruising around over this water. And water forms an amazingly important part of the photo, specifically because water is a reflector of light. So it gives depth to the base. And unlike the silhouette of the baobab here, where you have no light and no ability to see anything other than the silhouette, or the painted rocks of Isalu, where their first photo where everyone was lying and this was taken there. What I often like to do is, once I've got the photos with the guests all go to bed, and I sneak back into the rocks and spend the night up there. I must say it's quite freaky, but you know you're safe, but you're still a little worked up by the whole thing. The other thing you have to consider is the higher in altitude you go, the less atmosphere you have to shoot through, which gives you incredible results as to what the star magnificence would be. This was again in Madagascar, another late night walk out into the furthest cove, walking through the forest because there's no lions, so it's quite nice to not have to worry about something eating you there, and spending some time alone. And this for me is a great time to start clearing the head. You have an hour to 2 hours out there under the stars, the noise of nature around you, and really you're only pushing a button every minute or so, so you really have a lot of time to just be. And that's one of the things that really gets me about star photography. Now, like I said, water is a reflector of light. You don't always have to wait for it to be completely dark before taking a photo. An hour to an hour and a half after sunset, this was taken about an hour and a half after sunset. This is how much light still came off of the sunset. Plus we get the stars into it and the reflection of the water to add to the image. Now, the other thing we can do with star photography, which is quite weird, is take a panorama. Now, a panorama is a really wide photograph combined of, or a grouping of a number of photos combined to form one wide photograph or one very tall photograph. Now, the one problem we have is that it's difficult because of the time it takes and the movement of the Earth. So the constant battle, and I'll explain it a bit better in one of the images, is that the stars are moving. So by the time I get to the 6th photo, we are already 3 minutes later. The stars aren't where they were. It's very difficult for a computer to line those up and find them again. So we've got to keep the shutter speeds a bit shorter. We have to be methodical about how we are moving along. So we have to make sure the tripod head, in other words, is absolutely level to the T, because if it is not and it's slightly degraded, we might be framed correctly on the left here, but as we move along, we're actually going to end up taking just photos of the ground, or be so high we're just taking photos of the sky, and there's nothing to match up. So if we have perfect horizon, what we're going to get is this beautiful flow across, and we have to be patient when stitching. And I'm going to show you an example of how we do it. So this was an image I took at Sabi Private Game Reserve. And there's a lot that I've put in this image in order for it to, or for the computer to not have to fight too hard to line things up, because there were a lot of foreground trees, all nicely silhouetted against what is light pollution in the background. And the reason why I wanted to take a panorama here was to show the edge to edge of the Milky Way, because this is something that not a lot of people get to see. So I started on the left, and what I did with a 16mm lens was shoot vertically, so I get a taller photo, and then ensure that I have almost a 50% overlap of one image to the next. What this does is it means that the computer has more information to be able to help me stitch these together. And this was then a combination of 6 images put together to create this panorama. Yet again, another one, I showed you the shorter version of this. We did a longer version where we had this baobab as my subject and this broader Milky Way across. So you ensure again that the tripod level head is level, that there's a 50% in overlap, and if you're shooting a landscape, so a wide panorama, you shoot in portrait, or if you're shooting a vertical or a portrait panorama, you're shooting in landscape. So you have as much information as possible to pile on top of one another. This image here was my first attempt. And like I was saying, with this, there wasn't much to stitch together. So this was actually 24 images stuck on top of one another. So I took one image at the bottom on the left, then one above it, then one to the right of that, then down and across and across. And so I zigzagged my way through this image, and it took about half an hour to an hour for the computer to try and figure out the edit of this and how to stitch it together. And it turned out quite beautiful, but I must say that doing things like that and that are much easier to be able to work with. This again was about 4 images across in a reserve called Madikwe on a private safari. So here we're going to look at how I stitched this image together. So effectively what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose all my images. So I have 5 images, so it was made up of 5 images. I right click and I choose photo merge and go to panorama in Lightroom. It pops up and starts creating a panorama preview. I then choose auto crop to get it to choose the right crop for me. Boom, as quickly as that. And auto settings if I wish, but I'm not going to do that because I would prefer to create that. Or I can click fill edges and it will create new ones. But this created some funny entities, so I'd rather auto crop it in a little tighter and create something. We could choose different perspectives, but have a look at whichever one works. Some of them will work, some won't. Then the computer will take a moment and create the panorama. So here we have the panorama. Now we're going to go in and edit it. First thing I'm going to do is ensure that my exposure is correct and my white balance is right. I'm going to cool it down because the color for me of space is cold. And I'm going to lift the exposure slightly so that I have a bit more light. I'll bring the highlights down to drop down the light pollution. And I'm going to bring the shadows up to bring more of the foreground in. This is that dynamic range that we were talking about. I'm going to bump up some texture to bring some extra sharpening and some clarity to bring a little bit of edge definition. Now I'm going to choose a graduated filter, click on that, which is basically going to graduate my edit from top to bottom. I'm going to move it down to the top of this or the bottom of the sky, and then I'm going to boost my texture and my clarity, which automatically brings up and helps my stars, and then bump up the dehaze button, which really brings out those beautiful stars. I'll bring the whites up to bring a bit more light to the stars and drop the darks down to make it a bit darker. And there's the difference between A and B. You can see the vast difference that it makes. Very quick edit, 2 minutes, and that's what we've got. The other thing we can create are star trails. And star trails are fantastic because it is capturing something that the eyes cannot see. This image that you see here was actually a combination of 2 images. The first image, I painted the tree and got the light right in the foreground. The second image, I got the star trail going. And then in post-production, I separated the one sky from the other and replaced it with the trails to create a little bit more punchy thing. And again, this is my art. It might not be an accurate representation, but there's no way on this beautiful planet that you will be able to see that with your naked eye. So it now allows me to push that artistic bit a little bit further. So this is what it looks like. This was actually the first part of 2020 in Namibia. These are the stars starting to trail as the Earth begins to move. And as you can see here, this is celestial south. There's a very important part. Remember your celestial south or our celestial or celestial north in your hemisphere that allows us to be able to compose an image and create the pictures that we want. If you look carefully, each of those lines are different colors. They're actually representing the intensity or the light intensity and what phase the stars are in, whether they're tiny stars or new stars or these massive giant burning out stars like our super red giants like Betelgeuse. So remember, it is capturing an image that the eyes could never see. And there are two ways to shoot this. You can either do it in single shot, where you have a camera release, which we open up and we lock the shutter open and we leave it running for as long as we can. Or we stack images, where we take numerous images and then stack them on top of one another. That last trail that you saw was done by stacking. I used 670 images taken consecutively after one another with no gap in between the images to stack and create that image. So when we are doing a single exposure, the shortest one I would recommend for getting an accurate star trail would be about 30 minutes. And you can use 30 minutes in a dark setting. You could set to f4 and drop your ISO to 100 and leave it for that 30 minutes and you would get a good star trail. Medium length would be an hour to 2 hours. And again, as we're lengthening the time, we're having to halve that down. So if you are aware of how apertures work, a f-stop from f4 to f5.6 means our light is being halved, and vice versa. If we're going from 5.6 to f4, we're doubling the light. So if we're doubling the light, we need to halve the time, or vice versa. If we're halving the light, we need to double the time. Again, 5.6 to f8 for 2 hours and f11 for 4 hours. And this is a great thing, but you have to remember that long exposure noise reduction. One, we have thermal noise, not from the outside temperature, but also the temperature within the camera. The camera is now working overtime for 4 hours. Heat is going to be generated, thermal noise will be created. Plus our hot pixels will show up. So if we're doing any of these, we need to ensure that we have long exposure noise reduction turned on and that we have enough battery power that after 2 hours of shooting, it can take a second shot for 2 hours to get rid of the noise that's in place. Remember that this is a very important part. So you set up the camera and the tripod. If necessary, wrap a heat pack or dew heater around the lens. Now don't put it right on the lens, rather put some cloth around the lens, and then what that's going to do is it's going to warm the camera slowly and not intensely on the body, but it's going to add warmth, which is going to stop condensation on the front of the lens. Because if it is really cold, you're just going to get a wet or an icy layer on the front of the lens. You soften the focus. So we actually don't want the stars in focus. Remember how when we were out of focus, the stars were bigger and a little bit furry? What that means is our trails will become thicker because of the fact that this is on, or that our thing is done. We're going to take a 30-second test exposure with aperture wide open and a high ISO. This will allow us to check the focus and check composition. We dial in the aperture and the ISO settings for your chosen exposure time, set the camera to bulb mode, and open the shutter with a remote release. Come back after your desired time, and you're ready to rock and roll. Or you're going to be waiting for your noise reduction to take place. So your image quality should be on RAW. You want, especially with a single shot, you're only taking one photo, you want to be able to have as much information to edit after the fact. Your white balance, you could choose it. It can be on daylight, or you can choose to change the colors like we did with the light pollution photos. Drive mode can be single shot, and long exposure noise reduction needs to be on. I've tried it with it off, saying I will fix it in post-production. It doesn't work. Here's an example of a 30-minute exposure in Isalo. So very nice. Even 30 minutes allows us enough time to see those trails. When we're doing star stacking, what we can do is we can shorten the shutter speeds and create a different image. Now, we don't want something that is as bright as a Milky Way photo. The reason why is because then there are too many stars and too many trails. So you actually want to darken it down a bit. It sounds a bit counterintuitive. So what we're going to do is 30 seconds or 2 minutes or 5 minutes, and then choose the appropriate aperture and ISO. Now, I like 30 seconds because I don't have to set up a timer release for this. All I would do is stick it to my multiple shot, my continuous shooting, and I'll put it to 30 seconds. I'll set my aperture, set my ISO, and then lock open my remote release. And what this does is after 30 seconds, it's going to start the next 30-second one. It's like me taking a 10 photos in a second. If I hold that down, it goes to take those photos. Now it's doing it every 30 seconds. Just there is no time between the images, which allows me after the fact, if there was an interval of 1 second, you would have a 30-second trail with a 1 second gap, 30-second trail with a 1 second gap. So it would look like perforations or the middle part of where we can overtake on a road. So I like the 30-second exposures. Our image quality, depending on how many images we're going to take and the size of our card, can be RAW or JPEG, but I always prefer RAW. White balance, again, you can choose, but choose a single one. Do not choose auto, because if the light changes at all, it might change the warmth of your image and you will get different results as we go along. Drive mode, continuous. Long exposure noise reduction off, because I don't want it taking a 30-second photo and then doing noise reduction for 30 seconds. Focus is in manual, just so that it isn't refocusing in between photos, because it will try to refocus. So stick it to manual. I shoot all of my astrophotography in manual to ensure this is taken out. And this is the final result of that. Again, you can see how the colors of the stars have come out at their different frequencies and the beauty that can be created with these images. So that's all I have to say, Kendall. I give you a chance to say something while I have a sip of tea, please.
Great. Thank you so much, Richard. We've got some great questions for you. And I just want to remind everyone who's watching, if you have a question today, you can submit that in your control panel under the questions field. Okay, could you please pull up, Richard, the 2 apps that you recommended towards the beginning so people can
with pleasure
get those downloaded? Great.
See, this is why I love my other program to do things, because it makes it easier to get back to where we need to. There we go. Exterior, clear outside.
Great, wonderful, thank you. So when someone's preparing to go on a trip to Africa with us, we often recommend that they not bring a tripod. But if they want to do astrophotography, is it okay to bring one, or are there any that are ever provided? What are your thoughts on that?
So specifically on some of the photo trips that I do, we might have a few that we bought to travel along with us. But there are some very lightweight tripods that you can get for very cheap. So the one that my camera is actually on right now is a Manfrotto, and it weighs about 2 pounds. So it's really light. It's fairly sturdy. I wouldn't call it the sturdiest tripod, but for travel photography, it works really well, and it goes to this big. So it effectively weighs as much as the water bottle you're bringing along. So we can work with that. And generally on our photographic trips, we allow for a little bit of extra luggage, so just bear that in mind too. And the other cool tripod is a 3-legged thing. That's the brand name, is a 3-legged thing. Very cool to use. So those 2 come in very small sizes, but very sturdy at the same time. And Peak Design, I'm actually dying for one of these because I've been seeing it. There was a GoFundMe for this tripod design. It's also created a very small, very lightweight tripod, and I have a feeling it's even more sturdy than the ones I've been using. So one day when I'm big, I'll get one of those.
Great, thank you. Okay, so there's a couple questions here about focus. First one is, do you set camera to focus on the stars or something else in the photo, like a tree or a mountaintop?
So if it is a photo like this, where I have a tree as my silhouette, the tree is my focal point. That needs to be in focus. Nothing else in the photo requires focus besides the subject. The stars are still able to be seen, and there's no one that looks at a star photo like this right in front of their face except the photographer, because we like to go in and zoom in and analyze every single pixel that's there. It's a silly trait that we have, but in the greater scheme of things, when it is big like this, this is how we would photograph it. In a case of a photograph like this, I would be focusing 1/3 of the way in. So this rock in the middle was actually my focal point. This one, the focus was on the tree. And in these ones, I wanted soft focus on the stars. So I was trying to get the mountain in focus. So consider what you're doing, but for the most part, I'm focusing on my subject and not worried about the stars. So you can use a flashlight or something bright to focus on that point, and that will be your correct focus.
Mhm. Do you use focus peaking to help manual focus?
Unbelievable. If your camera has it, use it. For those who don't know what focus peaking is, it basically, the camera, when you're looking through your electronic viewfinder on the back part of it, it's mainly on the mirrorless cameras now. When you find focus, you actually get these zebra lines that come on that tell you which parts of your photo are in focus. It will work when there's light on the subject, but it's going to have a lot of trouble when there is no light to actually figure out what you're seeing. So bear that in mind, that it might not work if it's a pitch black outlook in front of you.
Mm-hmm. If you have any filters on your lenses, do you recommend removing them? And someone else asked, on a brightly moonlit night, would you use a neutral density filter to allow a longer exposure?
So the first question about filters on your camera, if you have any polarizing filter, neutral density filter, or anything, you take them off. You want as much light as possible, because we're trying to capture the light as fast as possible to counteract the movement of the Earth. Neutral density filter, on the other hand, for a brightly moonlit night is not going to make a difference. All it's going to do is darken your stars and lengthen your shutter speed to the point that they're going to stretch out, and it's very difficult to balance that out. So my honest opinion is that we rather try and create a trail like that on a bright moonlit night, because it gets so bright, rather than playing around with any filters at night.
All right. Is it possible to capture a meteor shower when you're doing the Star Trails photo shoot?
It absolutely is. There was a photo when we were doing this. I'm just going to figure out which one it was. So if you look carefully here, there is a meteor that came through there, but there was another one that had a better representation of it. I will find it for you. But yes, if there's a meteor shower, shoot, and more shooting, because you will get some really cool results with meteor showers. Which one had it? There's a meteor coming through here on the side here. Doesn't show up too bright, and there's another one that's a bit more brighter in the background. But if it's a proper meteor shower and you're getting big rocks coming in, you will definitely get some cool results out of that.
Great. Question about Lightroom. Does Lightroom's photo merge work with focus stacking as well?
Not that I know of. So the focus stacking, you actually have to do in Photoshop. I don't think Lightroom does any focus stacking at this stage.
Okay. Someone had a pretty specific question here. It looks like they want to shoot a bright moon in between trees, and they're just wondering what are the best settings for that?
I'll bet you it's from William. And the answer is you need a faster shutter speed. So your moon needs to be in focus. So again, shooting on a tripod, and you want to be at about 400th of a second plus in order to get a fast enough shutter speed to bring the definition out in the craters. So you need to make sure that the moon's not too bright. We want that exposure on the moon to be correct and everything else to be dark around it.
Okay, I don't know if you will have a good answer for this next question, but we'll ask it anyway. You spoke about shooting in hot desert conditions and heat noise. Do you have any advice for shooting in the Arctic and capturing the northern lights?
Right, so the northern lights are far brighter than what the stars would be. So we're actually shooting at far slower shutter speeds. It's one of my dreams to be able to go and shoot the Aurora Borealis and Australis if possible. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge, NatHab. I'm available when trips run again. But we're probably shooting at about 10 seconds for that because we don't want to overexpose it. We want to capture those wispy movements, but you can't do too long. In this case, a low-level neutral density filter might work to be able to accentuate longer amounts of the aurora going for longer, so you get a bit more movement in it, but we've got to balance that out in the light source. So all you do is take test shots. You know, you're really going to be at like 1600 ISO, 10 seconds, and again wide open, because we want to try and minimize that. And our stars, we're not worried if the stars are moving because we're really trying to capture the movement of the aurora.
Mm-hmm. And we've done some, Court Whalen, one of our other photo guides, he's done a presentation on shooting the northern lights, and you can find those if you're interested on our website at nathab.com/webinars. You want to look under the daily dose replays, and it'll be under photography. All right, well, we're getting close to the top of the hour. Richard, thank you so much for this. This was so fascinating. I love looking at your photos. You've got such beautiful shots of the stars. Thank you so much for sharing those with us. I'm going to hand it back over to you for closing comments.
Thanks, guys, and thanks for taking the time out of your wonderful Wednesday to listen in. And I really hope that you've got this, and I hope that we are together soon, very soon, so that I can teach you how to do this in person under a beautiful night sky. Thanks, NatHab, thanks, WWF, and thanks, Kendall, for helping and hosting these.
Thank you so much, Richard. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation, and we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks, Kendall. Thanks, guys. Bye.